Among its many other provisions, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, the sweeping budget bill President Donald Trump signed into law last month, includes significant changes to the country's energy policy. For one, it ends key tax credits for wind and solar energy much earlier than outlined in the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, which the Joe Biden administration passed in 2022. It expands support for nuclear and geothermal energy as well as fossil fuels like oil, gas, and coal, and it clarifies tax incentives for low-carbon hydrogen. Ultimately, it has important implications not only for the future of energy, but for efforts to decarbonize and confront climate change. We have Ken Medlock, director of our Center for Energy Studies, back on the podcast to discuss the industry-specific impacts and whether or not this is good energy policy when it comes to consumer costs, the grid, and, of course, meeting emissions reductions targets. I'm David Satterfield, director of Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy in Houston, Texas, and this is Baker Briefing. Ken, thank you for joining us again today.
Glad to be here.
To start, let's review what were the major provisions of the 2022 IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, regarding clean energy policy. What progress on climate action did it represent or did it intend to advance? And then finally, but not least, what has been the response of the energy industry to the IRA? How have they taken advantage of, confronted, had differences with, and their investment advisors with this piece of legislation?
So we have to take a step back when we want to talk about the IRA and talk about other pieces of legislation that were also passed under the previous administration. So the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, really set aside a significant amount of funding directed at multiple investment opportunities to sort of stimulate sort of shovel readiness, if you will, sort of build stuff. Energy was a major component of that. Of course, the hydrogen hubs was something that sort of fell out of the IIJA, and it boils down to effectively a grant program where the government actually allocates, after reviewing a series of applications, funding to create hubs for these low carbon energy, hydrogen in particular, energy resources to evolve. The IRA, in many ways, was a addition to that suite of legislation. What the IRA did is put in place a series of tax incentives that would affect the investments that would be triggered under the IIJA and the stimulatory impacts of those investment dollars that would be flowing from the government to create these new hubs. And low carbon hydrogen was a significant beneficiary of that. Now, it wasn't just there. There were many other sort of grant programs and other things stimulated under the IIJA that the IRA was able to leverage. And so when you look at what happened under the Biden administration, it was a collection of legislation. I didn't even mention the CHIPS Act, but there was a collection of legislation that really promised to be game-changing with regard to the U.S. approach to energy, in particular low-carbon energy. As a matter of fact, in the international community, when the IRA was passed, there was a robust reaction by the international community, in particular European governments and companies that were operating in Europe, saying this is not fair. The U.S. has just tilted the scale. There's no way we can compete in an international landscape, particularly when you start talking about things like hydrogen and low carbon hydrogen and international transit. And
in other words, Ken, the interpretation of the international market was this is helpful. This is good for the U.S. energy industry.
That is precisely right. In many ways, though, that was reaction. It didn't necessarily pan out in terms of dollars spent, right? And to be blunt, that makes sense because you can stimulate something, but when you do that through government funding, you actually put pressure on nascent supply chains that aren't developed enough to support the level of activity that is starting to manifest. And when that happens, you get inflation, you get cost pressures. And we started to see that in some of these dimensions. But the interesting thing about the IRA in particular is because it acted through a series of tax incentives, so tax credits, investment tax credits, production tax credits, things like this, it required the Treasury Department to issue guidance on how those incentives could be accessed. Some of that guidance was not issued in a very timely manner. As a matter of fact, when you look at, for example, clean hydrogen tax credits, 45V as it's often referred to, the initial guidance was issued, and typically what happens when the guidance is issued, there's a period where there's a public review period where you can submit comments, right? Yeah, the comment period. So you go through that period, and then you have a hearing where you talk about all those comments, you reconcile things, and then you issue final guidance. Well, that latter part never happened. And we ended up sliding beyond that window of time before an election, where once that guidance is passed, it's solidified, it's sort of steadfast in law. And now you're in that window of time where the Administrative Procedures Act matters, right? And you can actually go through a congressional review to pull guidance that was issued sort of hastily just before an election happened or just after an election happened because you know there's going to be a change in power and turn it over. And so a lot of that stuff got thrown into that mix. So the advanced manufacturing tax credit, which has an impact on batteries, for example, the clean hydrogen tax credit, the 45V that I mentioned, these fell under that purview. And so they were full game once the outcome of the election was revealed. Now, when you advance into what ultimately happened with the OBBBA, all of that stuff got called into question. What's interesting, though, is because it was legislation, it was done through reconciliation because it has budgetary implications. It was able to advance on basically a strict party line. Unfortunately, over the last decade or so, we've gotten very used to seeing this kind of action in Washington. But what it meant was that we were able to call into question things under the IRA where guidance had already been issued and clarified well before all of these other, this window of time where the APA and the Congressional Review Act actually come into play. And so you end up shortening the time horizon, so changing the tax credit rules for wind and solar. So it used to be that they wouldn't start phasing out until you get into the early 2030s, and then they actually start to roll off. Now they phase out next year, right? So much more quickly. And so that, of course, sent a shockwave through the system, through the energy system about what are we going to do with wind and solar development without these tax credits, without these incentives in place? But it also did other things. It extended the time horizon for things like advanced nuclear, for geothermal. It altered the way tax credits apply for what is often referred to as 45Q. So this is carbon capture. In fact, what it did is it levelized the tax credit that could be received for injecting carbon for enhanced oil recovery with the tax credit that was already in the law and in the books for permanent sequestration. So this is where you get into class 2 versus class 6 wells. But what was interesting about that is by raising the tax credit for enhanced oil recovery, where there's a value add associated with the CO2 capture and use, it's probably going to incentivize more of that activity, which is an interesting outcome because you could actually see growth in the carbon capture industry as a result of the OBBBA. On advanced nuclear and geothermal, those are not short-term plays. Those are long-term plays, right? But the ability of both of those types of energy technologies, because they're dispatchable, they're baseload, they're very energy dense, to reduce carbon emissions long-term is tremendous. But affecting that outcome is entirely dependent on whether or not industry can actually grab the ball and run with it. And that's really where we get into what are the costs associated with all of this.
So Ken, the IRA is only 3 years old.
Yeah.
To what extent had the energy industry, in whole or in part, begun to make critical longer-term investment decisions, market decisions, based on the IRA's original provisions?
Oh, there had been significant movement based on the IRA's original provisions, but it's not just the IRA, it's also the IIJA. It's the collection of legislation under the previous administration. You saw companies like Exxon and Chevron really beef up their low carbon solutions business units, bring in new hires, in some cases externally, which was kind of out of the ordinary for some of these companies, right? And really begin to staff up and look at pathways to make significant investments and scale up activity in these spaces. In some cases, that has been scaled back. In other cases, it's been fine-tuned. But certainly with the passage of this recent legislation, it has changed. So the strategy going forward, because of the absence of those significant subsidy support mechanisms through the IRA in some cases, is different. Now, whether or not different means worse remains to be seen in terms of emissions reductions goals, because it really depends on how these companies lean into what they do and do well and ultimately execute projects that at their core are not just about federal incentives, it's also about state and local incentives. And this is where we get into things like wind and solar. Yes, the absence of those tax credits is damaging for investments at the margin. But there has long been a lot of discussion about how these are the lowest cost resources available for adding generation to the grid. If that is the case, you have an issue where some of the analysis of the impacts of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act have been saying power prices are going to go up because you're not going to see investment. That's inconsistent with them being the lowest cost assets. If they are truly the lowest cost assets, if power prices start to climb, you should see an acceleration of investment in those things. So it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out. But at the local level, you've also seen local system operators and public utility commissions put in motion things that will help all forms of generation. So, for example, taking steps to shorten the interconnect queue. So this is a queue that projects get into when they're looking to make a final investment decision, that they have to get approval to actually be able to connect into a grid. Once they have that approval, then you'll actually start to see things begin to move forward. If you can collapse that, shrink it so that it's a shorter window, it cuts costs and allows things to move more quickly. So,
Ken, you've talked in a very technical way about the impact of the IRA and the One Big Beautiful Bill. Is there a policy rationale that makes the cuts on wind, solar, batteries sensible? And what I'm getting at here is the Trump administration has framed wind and solar power as unreliable. In contrast to fossil fuels, there have been other more emotional, less fact-based arguments against these power sources. Are what we're seeing here rational policy decisions based on economics, on markets, on technology, or is this another part of the culture war regarding climate?
that is a great question. And unfortunately, it is one that in the broader media, depending on which channel you tune into, you will get a different answer. It's physics, and physics don't care about who's in office. When we talk about the functioning of electric power grids, one of the most important elements of reliable service on a power grid is controllability. The issue of controllability has become more and more at the forefront of conversations at public utility commissions led by system operators and market actors. And you get into what are the solutions to more intermittent resources like wind and solar that you don't control, because when the wind blows, you get wind power. When the sun shines, you get solar power. When those two things don't happen, you don't get either one. So you need adequacy of other resources in order to manage that variability. One of the things that has capitalized on that variability quite well over the last few years is batteries. So batteries have seen explosive growth, particularly in a place like ERCOT in Texas. You've seen just a massive investment in battery capacity, largely because wholesale price volatility is much higher today. So you can capture that buy low, right? So you're buying that low cost power, right? And then you're selling it back to the grid when the price spikes, when the wind and solar aren't available. And that's a fantastic arb that battery owners can capture.
And I believe Texas surpassed California in the last year as
is
gigawatt
remarkable.
capacity.
Yes. Texas is remarkable in terms of what it has. It's long been known as, the capital of oil and gas, but it's also the capital of wind, solar, and batteries. So it's an interesting example of where capture the comparative advantages, have the right economic and market environment, and everything works.
Ken, two fact questions for you. First, in Texas, does the wind and solar power industry make it on market factors alone, or does it depend on subsidizing?
So wind and solar are very capital intensive in terms of what you spend up front. Once they're in place, the variable cost of operation is near zero. So it is truly the lowest cost form of power to the grid once it's in place. But you need that, historically, you have needed that subsidy revenue because it's a promise to pay a particular price for power that you're going to generate when you can generate in order to underwrite the financing of the development of the project. So this is where the whole tax equity finance industry sort of spawned from. It is in many ways kind of like a mark-to-market accounting exercise because you've got a guaranteed payment from the government through this subsidy. And so that allows you a guaranteed revenue that you can book and a bank is willing to lend against, right? So absent those tax revenues, it's going to be interesting to see how those two industries, wind and solar in particular, are able to pitch what the value going forward looks like in order to get adequate financing to continue to develop, because all the cost is up front.
And what's your assessment of the likelihood of these industries, solar and wind, being able to make that case, being able to continue?
Wind was starting to run into a bit of a roadblock in certain places like Texas, where it's already grown a lot. And it had nothing to do with the subsidies. It has to do with the fact that you keep adding capacity. But when the wind blows, it blows everywhere in Texas. And so when that happens, all that power is coming at the same time, which means the price is getting driven down to zero. In some cases, you would see negative pricing at wholesale, market hubs. When that happens, there is very little ability to generate any revenue to the asset. And so that begins to compromise the viability of the next investment in wind, right? So absent the subsidies, we've kind of hit a point where the market really needs to continue to expand in order to absorb additional capacity. Otherwise, you run into a continued need to curtail wind power when it's actually available. And that then triggers a conversation about expanding transmission, which is another cost for the system that somebody has to pay for. So it becomes a political issue. But at the end of the day, it ends up hitting our bills. So that's why these are not simple decisions. With solar, we weren't quite there yet, and we still aren't quite there yet. So there's still a little latitude for solar to grow. What's probably most interesting in all of this, though, is batteries. There's still a lot of opportunity for continued growth in batteries, even without, the same level of subsidization. And by the way, you got to make a clarification here. Batteries weren't hampered by the OBBBA. What was hampered was anything that you can sort of make an argument that there's a foreign entity of concern connected to the supply chain for the deployment
China
of those. Exactly.
And the panels.
Exactly. So this is where you get into what fraction of your total asset in terms of cost originates somewhere in a supply chain where a foreign entity of concern like China has a dominant position. If you can demonstrate that it doesn't, then you can qualify for the subsidy. If you can't, it goes away. And so this is where you end up in some interesting space because the subsidies for battery technology and its deployment, they weren't really diminished. It's really that foreign entities of concern issue that has been heightened through the new legislation that really will hamper, if it hampers at all, battery deployment. So,
Ken, getting into further specifics of the One Big Beautiful Bill, what are the changes specifically that differentiate geothermal and nuclear powers treated by the bill from other forms of energy? What does the bill do?
It's tax credits. It's literally, if you invest, and I believe the window is through 2033. So if you start construction in these technologies and you qualify for the tax credit, which they're production tax credits, investment tax credits, but like a production tax credit, for example, if I start construction on the asset before that expiry date, that allows me to collect that tax credit for the life of the asset as long as I'm producing power.
What does that mean in construction in terms of the nuclear energy? Because we've all been looking at modular reactors. Are they addressed in this act?
So the terms have to be defined by Treasury, right? So this is where you get into what is the guidance that's going to be issued. And some of that has not been done yet. So we're still waiting to see how that plays out. But Trump actually, through executive order after the OBBBA was passed, issued a directive to the Treasury Department to try to accelerate even further how fast you can unwind the tax credits for wind and solar. So this is how do you issue the guidance, and this is where you get into how do you define construction, right? When construction has begun and how far along the path you are. So we're still waiting to see what that looks like. But unfortunately, we don't know the full answer to that yet. It really does become an issue of what Treasury ultimately issues as initial guidance. We go through the comment period, and then final guidance is ultimately laid out. But we'll see. But make no mistake, geothermal's farther along than nuclear. We already have geothermal assets that are under development. Companies like Fervo are really heavy into the advanced geothermal space and doing some pretty interesting things. So this could potentially be a kickstart, right, for that industry. Advanced nuclear, we've still got a bit of a pathway to walk down. And that's where this administration has a lot more to do, because there is a regulatory spider web like no other when it comes to deploying nuclear technology. So a lot of that's going to have to be addressed, and that's not legislative.
Got it. Hydrogen industry. What's the consequence of the bill for hydrogen?
Mixed bag. The expansion of 45Q, which is the carbon capture tax credit, which allows injection for enhanced oil recovery, so any enhanced recovery, to have the same tax credit that injection for permanent storage has, could actually accelerate blue hydrogen. So I'm going to use the rainbow here. Now, a lot of people don't like this, but this is low carbon hydrogen from natural gas. It could accelerate efforts to do more of that. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. At the end of the day, it really is about what are the various costs along the supply chain to deploy the technology. And this is true of any of these technologies we're talking about. But it could actually help blue hydrogen production, because you couldn't stack under the IRA the clean hydrogen production tax credit with the carbon capture tax credit. So you did one or the other. But by raising the tax credit for carbon capture and storage into enhanced oil recovery activities, you actually provide an additional benefit to that supply chain that could potentially overcome some cost impediments and drive additional investment. And I know some of the large companies that are looking at hydrogen and clean hydrogen businesses have been leaning into this. You know, there's a large one that has a project that they're still evaluating, Exxon, for example, in I think it's in Baytown. They bought Denbury a couple of years ago, and everybody was like, well, what's that about? It was about their asset base, because Dunbury was actually the owner of was part of the supply chain for the Paris project, which was taking carbon that was captured from a coal-fired generation facility just sort of southwest of Houston, right? And moving it up into oil fields in East Texas for injection that was being used for enhanced recovery. But that asset was really the crown jewel in that acquisition, because it allowed Exxon to start thinking about how do we pivot into a low carbon enterprise. And by buying that asset, they had a backbone. And now with this additional stimulus through 45Q on enhanced oil recovery injection, it makes that look more valuable. So it remains to be seen how all of these different pieces, when they're, in terms of their juxtaposition, play out, how Exxon continues to advance with that project, but it still does look fairly promising. So that's the sort of that part of clean hydrogen. Now, the other part of clean hydrogen, which is where you get into, use of wind, for example, or solar to run an electrolyzer, that's expensive. And it was unclear, even with the initial guidance under 45V, which is what allows you to capture the tax credit, that most companies would be able to meet the requirements under 45V and capture the full value of the tax credit. So that was facing some impediments anyway in certain parts of the country. Now, in other parts of the country, or world for that matter, right? So getting outside of the United States, where energy prices are generally higher, right? You can absorb a higher cost of production because you can still compete into that space. So it entirely depends on where you are in the country in the United States, because the price of hydrogen in the Gulf Coast, right, in terms of what you have to be able to produce hydrogen at and compete against the existing value chain, is different than if you're, say, up near Chicago or in the Northeast or on the West Coast. So it depends on where you are.
And the impact of the bill on classic fossil fuels, oil, gas, and coal.
Minimal. There's been a lot made of its potential stimulatory impacts. Royalty rates on federal lands were rolled back from 16 to 12%. That's marginal at best in terms of stimulating new investments, particularly offshore, which is where the majority of, interest is when it comes to federal acreage. Most oil and gas in the United States is not produced on federal lands. It's actually produced on private lands. So that royalty relief doesn't really have an impact on everybody else. The other thing that was interesting that is potentially stimulatory is in the IRA, there were certain things done to the way intangible drilling costs could be expensed. They were actually penalized relative to the status quo prior to the IRA. That was undone. So it's sort of like going back to what it used to look like, which is beneficial because it allows you to accelerate depreciation on assets that you don't have a salvage value for. That's why it's called intangible. So if you're contracting for a well logging service, you can actually accelerate the depreciation of that expense, right? And that allows you to offset basically what your taxable revenues are for a given year.
But can it, at a 70,000 foot view, oil, gas, coal, their status increases, decreases,
and that's what I'm
drilling
getting to.
decisions. Is it affected by the bill?
And that's exactly what I'm getting to. Policy in general, when it comes to well-defined markets like you have for the hydrocarbons, it can shape things at the margin, but the market ultimately dictates what commercial actors do. And if the price environment is a little bit lower 5 years from now than it is today, those things at the margin aren't really going to do anything, right? If the price environment goes up, then you'll be willing to look as a commercial developer at acreage that you wouldn't otherwise look at, which when you then evaluate the economics of the decision, given these new provisions, it might at the margin stimulate a little additional activity. But at the end of the day, it really is, what does the market tell you to do?
And it's the market, not Washington, that says drill, baby, drill or not.
That is 100% true. There's an irony. I honestly don't know where drill, baby, drill first came from, but it's been used by both sides of the aisle now, right? You might remember famously when prices were spiking and Jennifer Granholm came to CERAWeek and proclaimed drill, baby, drill, right? And everybody was sort of shocked, but it's like, it's not politicians' decision, and especially in the U.S. where the U.S. government doesn't own any oil and gas, right? It's literally stuff that is done through commercial decision-making by private actors, and the government can't tell them what to do. It literally is, what is the market telling these companies to do? Because at the end of the day, satisfying investors is what drives activity.
Ken, where's coal going?
Nowhere. It's an interesting sort of irony when we think about things like energy security. The U.S. has on the order of 26% of the world's recoverable coal. So it's massive. In terms of resource distribution and access to that resource, it's larger than anything else you can think of that's out there. So oil, gas, coal is more lopsided in U.S. favor than anything. But it's lost its market presence not because of policy. It's lost its market presence because of cost. We had the shale revolution, low-cost natural gas. It's cheaper. And developing resources, generation resources to use gas is cheaper. And so at the end of the day, gas is outcompeting coal. And that's exactly what you've seen over the last 12 to 15 years. And that's not going to change.
Declarative, rhetorical policy doesn't bring back, quote, big, beautiful coal, close quote.
Not at all. In fact, and I'm actually working on a piece with our residential historian, Julie Cohn, where we're looking at presidential proclamations all the way back to the 1970s. And it is remarkable when you dive into the Federal Register and look at the record and transcripts of speeches, how often things have been said and they mount to nothing. And it just reinforces the fact that it is about cost. It's about price. It's about markets. It's about return on investment. That is what drives activity.
Very good. Ken, the grid, the electrical power grid, something that we're looking at very deeply here for Texas, but beyond that for the nation. What's going to be happening to the grid because of AI, power demands, in general, rising demands on the grid? How does this act do or not do anything to advance electrical power grid needs, concerns?
The grid is an interesting animal. There are issues that system operators have been very cognizant of for quite some time. Reliability concerns are not new, and they tend to rear their head periodically. So, for example, if you go back to the late 70s, early 80s, there's a lot of concern because of load growth and increased electrification that we were going to run short of power at different periods of time. And this triggered a wave of different kinds of responses, one of which was the Public Utilities Regulatory Policy Act. So this actually required utilities to purchase power from industrials who had cogeneration facilities who needed heat, but were also generating electricity. They could sell that power to the grid at the avoided cost. So in a time of very tight supply-demand balance, the price goes up. So to the utility, the avoided cost is a very high price. And so for the industrial power generator, that's a boon, right? So you actually saw through PURPA, because of that guaranteed offtake and the definition of what are called qualifying facilities, an increase in cogeneration development, which helped ultimately solve the reliability issue. As we move forward and we see what's going on with a need for dispatchable generating assets to be able to provide power to the grid, in many ways, you can look back to the late 70s and early 80s for guidance as to what might be coming as we move through the next 4 to 5 years. I actually see a picture, if you will, in which data centers, as they're expanded, and this is connected to the AI question, obviously, they need electricity and they need it in stable supply. So they need baseload resources. Connecting to a grid is not always the best way to do that. So what you're actually seeing a lot of these hyperscalers do is build their own generation.
Behind the meter.
Yes, behind the meter generation assets so that they can control their own destiny. Now, when you do that, you have to build more than you need at a moment's notice, because you're going to have planned outages, unplanned outages, system maintenance, all that kind of stuff. So as you go through that process, you have excess capacity that's going to be sitting there idle at any given moment in time. So imagine a world in which the market gets tight because the sun's setting, the wind's not picking up, and you need power on the grid. The system operator is going to see those idle assets and think, I wish I could actually wheel that into the system. Those actors are going to be looking at the same thing and saying, I'm glad I'm not paying that high price. Oh, but what if I could generate power by exercising that excess capacity for that hour a day, right? And wheel that into the grid. And you're going to have some interesting conversations emerge as a result of that. And the irony of this is that data center expansion could actually solve the reliability crisis. This is something that a lot of people aren't even talking about.
And could be an impetus to cut through that spider web
Bingo.
Of regulation on modular reactors.
Bingo. So that's where you get into a situation where, because you're doing this behind the meter, the regulatory fabric for installation is different. You can do it faster, right? But if you're sitting there with idle excess capacity, a grid operator is going to see that, and there's going to be a negotiation at some point, because there is a mutually beneficial trade.
It's going to settle.
That's
yes.
Exactly right.
The market is going to settle.
That is exactly right.
Consumer costs in all of this, clean energy employment. What are the impacts?
So I guess it depends on how you define clean energy, right? If you focus only on wind and solar, it's not good. But if you expand that to include batteries, include geothermal, include nuclear, include high voltage transmission, which is also stimulated under recent legislation, then in the wash, it could end up being better in the long run, not worse, because you're talking about stable generation, large scale facilities, massive capital costs up front, a lot of construction, a lot of sort of shovel ready jobs, if you will. So I think the jury's still out on that, to be blunt.
EVs,
the subsidies for electric vehicles have been rolled back under the recent legislation. There's still an ongoing battle with regard to funding that was awarded through the IIJA. So this was grant funding to deploy and develop EV charging stations across the country. I think it was $100 billion or so, right? Most of that money has not been spent to date. And the Trump administration suspended the distribution of that, and that's actually in court now. That just creates delays, which adds to uncertainty, which is unfortunate for those individuals who want to buy EVs. But EVs were running into a bit of a roadblock anyway. If you look at the way they've been adopted across the U.S. landscape, it's primarily in the top 10% of household incomes, and even more heavily so in the top 5% of household incomes. That's because there's a price point that matters, again, the market, right? If you can't afford to buy it, you won't buy it. If you don't have the ability to charge it, you won't buy it. If you live in an urban area in an apartment complex, you don't have the ability to purchase and install a recharging station at your apartment. You want your landlord to do that. But what incentive does your landlord have to do that? Is he going to do this and hope? It's not a build it and they will come sort of mentality, right? So you're sort of stuck in this sort of limbo period where I can't buy an EV because there's nowhere to charge it, so I won't buy an EV. And so you don't see that sort of infiltrate lower income levels, areas in urban sort of settings where there's a lack of charging infrastructure. So there are impediments to adoption that were starting to reveal themselves. And that has actually showed up in numbers, in the sales numbers for EVs. And for some reason, it's not always recognized, but it is a very real phenomenon. So until we get to a point where recharging is ubiquitous, it's going to be difficult to see rapid adoption at lower income levels. And here's the other thing. There have been attempts to turn this into a social issue, looking at where recharging stations have been constructed and saying there's not enough in low income areas. I counter that, and this might sound crass, but would you build a gasoline station in the middle of the Mojave Desert? No, you wouldn't, because there's no demand for what you would sell. It's not a social issue. It's literally you're building these things to provide a service where it is demanded. Mm-hmm. So until you actually see that demand signal arise through the market, they're not going to proliferate in those locations.
So, Ken, two final questions for you. The big issue of carbon emissions, to the extent that any of this matters anymore in regulation and law, what's the impact of the bill?
So another way to say that is, will the bill negatively impact, and I've heard it framed this way, that's why I'm going to say it this way, carbon reduction goals, right?
Sure.
Well, then you get into a discussion about, well, what are the goals, right? And under this administration, that is not a point of emphasis. The goals for carbon reduction, when you think about them, really have to come from the commercial landscape. So what do investors prioritize? And there still is an emphasis on carbon reduction, but there is also a heavy emphasis on return on investment. The two shall meet somewhere in the middle, right? But make no mistake, capital chases returns. So if you start pouring money into things that do not generate adequate returns for investment, those things will not continue to happen. And the companies that are doing that will have to shift course. We've seen this pretty radically already. And by the way, it started to happen, particularly across the international oil company space, before Trump was elected. So it is about returns on investment. So you're starting to see capital flow shift to things that can generate adequate returns, but also are emphasizing, how do we reduce emissions intensity? How do we actually cut carbon emissions? Recognizing that you're not going to be able to necessarily do it all at once. And so there is a long path in front of us. But make no mistakes, companies in the energy landscape are still taking steps to try to reduce their emissions portfolio. That is something that investors have made clear, and in different countries around the world is prioritized more or less, but it's still very relevant.
So the bill itself, good, bad, mix of the two, ugly? How do you describe it?
It depends on where you sit. If you are in the wind or solar industry, it's not good. If you are in the geothermal or nuclear industry, it's promising. If you're in the oil and gas industry, it delivers some things that you had lobbied for. So it's a mix. It literally is a mix. And it's like anything else. Your view of the world depends on where you sit. So it's no different in this case.
Great. And finally, are we going to sit at the next COP?
I think there will be U.S. representation, but it will not be in the traditional official capacity. It's interesting, COP is, of course, in Brazil this year. And we will this fall be hosting an event to look back at the previous COPs, what the role of the COPs going forward are. We're doing this in partnership with IBP in Brazil and FGV. So, these are entities that are, in that location that are very involved in the agenda setting for the next COP. So that should be an interesting set of dialogues. But internationally, right, the entire discussion around carbon and around what should be the discussions at COP has been changing. Adaptation, for example, is now part of the conversation, and 5 years ago, it was not. So this is where we get into how do you actually mitigate damages rather than just talk about reducing emissions? And both matter. So it's actually, from an environmental economics perspective, a healthy development. Now it's an issue of how do you actually thread the needle and find that socially efficient outcome where you're making people better off as a result of these negotiations. So the U.S. position in the COP meetings is going to be pretty much non-existent for the next four meetings. But I'm going to hazard a guess after that, we'll be back at the table because it's too important.
Ken, more to come on all of these issues. Thank you. Baker Briefing is brought to you by the Baker Institute for Public Policy, which provides meaningful, nonpartisan policy analysis on the most critical challenges facing the United States, Texas, and the world. This episode was produced by Karina Zemmel. AV production was led by Kevin Young. Be sure to visit us at bakerinstitute.org to learn more. Thank you for listening.